In this video I'm going to talk about my BBC copyright dispute and how to dispute YouTube copyright claims. And to do that I'm going to talk a little bit about copyright in general and the things that you should think about when making your YouTube videos. For those of you that don't know, I also run another channel called BlackBeltBarrister, which is an educational resource I set up to help people learn a little bit more about law. Intellectual property is one of my specialist practice areas, so of course that includes copyright. So when we think about copyright disputes, particularly those on YouTube, it's important to understand the basics and fundamentals of how copyright works. It may or may not be obvious to you that you shouldn't use material that you don't own or have the authority or license to use. Broadly speaking, that means if someone else has created the work or has been assigned ownership of the copyright of that work, you cannot use it unless you have their permission. But there are exceptions, and whilst each jurisdiction has their own set of laws, such as the United States and the United Kingdom, the principles that will allow you to use this material without authorization are quite similar. Many people will get frustrated if they get a copyright claim on one of their YouTube videos, especially if they've put a lot of time and work into the video, and especially if they have complied with copyright laws. So let's think about what copyright actually is and why it exists in the first place. You can think of copyright as an exclusive set of rights to control how a work is used and the ability to earn from it. Those rights can be assigned to another person or another company, or they can be licensed on a very limited basis, in other words, for a very specific use or specific period of time, and the rights will control how that work is being used. If you want to use this work, you can always ask for permission. This should be as simple as contacting the copyright holder or the person that administers those rights and seek permission on a limited license basis. And this is what I did with the BBC, and I'm going to tell you what happened. But first I think it's important to explore some scenarios where you don't need permission if you are using the work in accordance with copyright laws. These are known as exceptions and often referred to as fair use. The most widely known example is news reporting. There's a copyright exception for news reporting that allows reporters to use copyrighted materials as long as they stick to certain conditions. Generally, those conditions are as follows. 1, that it cannot be a photograph. 2, that it must be real reporting of a current event. 3, the reporting must be fair. And 4, it must have a sufficient acknowledgement attached to it. But most YouTube creators are not going to be news reporters. But if you still want to make use of copyrighted material, you need to look to something else. And this is what most people understand as fair use of copyright. But this is where it gets complicated. It's important to flag up at this stage that fair use can only be decided conclusively by a judge in your jurisdiction. But broadly, there are 4 factors to consider when looking at your material and deciding whether it is making fair use of a copyrighted work. The first of these is probably the most fundamental. It looks at the purpose and the character of the use of the copyrighted work. And under this category, courts will generally look at 2 things. Firstly, whether your use of the material is transformative, which I'll come to in a minute, and whether it's commercial. Commercial use is less likely to be considered fair use because if you are using someone's copyrighted material to generate income, then that's generally considered to be against the original rights of the copyright holder. So the most important thing for you to think about is whether your use of the material transforms the original or adds new meaning. In other words, if somebody is watching your video, even though there is copyrighted material underneath it, does your video add new meaning, expression, criticism, and altogether a different finished work at the end of it? One way to think of this is to ask yourself, if someone were to watch your video, could that be considered as a substitute for watching the original copyrighted work? If that is simply impossible, and watching your video can only be seen as watching your new version, new expression, new meaning, criticism, or review of the underlying material, then it is more likely to be fair use. The second element to consider under fair use is whether it is factual or purely fictional. Generally, factual is more likely to be fair use than fictional because it's more likely to be akin to news reporting or education. The third consideration is how much of the original material that you've used. For example, if a film is an hour long and you've only added 2 or 3 minutes sporadically throughout the hour, but the rest of the material remains the same, again, that's not likely to be considered fair use. If, on the other hand, you've taken small elements, 2 or 3 minutes at a time, and added your own criticism, review, and observation on top of it, essentially to give it new meaning, and the overall length of your video is only, say, 10% or less of the original copyrighted work, this is much more likely to be considered fair use by the courts. And the final element to consider for fair use is the effect that your video is likely to have on the copyright owner's ability to profit from their original work. Again, a little bit like the first element, if somebody cannot simply watch your video as an alternative to the original copyright, it is more likely to be fair. But if someone is more likely to watch your version as a substitute for the copyrighted work, in other words, not paying for the copyrighted work, it is less likely to be fair use. All of these elements are brought together to consider the effect that your new video will have on the original copyright holder's right both to publish the work and to profit from it. So with that as a broad outline on what fair use is, I'm going to talk about the video that I made. So the BBC released a TV series called Silk, which depicted life at the Bar of England and Wales, particularly as a criminal barrister, although other areas of law crept in as well. The show received mixed views from members of the bar, although generally speaking, it was a reasonably good interpretation of what life at the bar is like. Always busy, usually very stressful, and very often fraught with difficulties. But what I found interesting about the show is that there were many intricacies of how the court systems work, and I wanted to share them with my new channel so people could understand the life of a barrister and whether the show was accurate. So I had the idea of doing a Cinema Sins style teardown of each episode of Silk, beginning with Season 1, Episode 1. So I painstakingly went through the episode. I never intended to include all of it, partly for the reasons I've said. I didn't want to use too much of the copyrighted work in my video so as to come outside of the fair use remit. So I picked certain areas and left others out. I thought it would be interesting to refer to some elements as educational points and to some elements as being slightly inaccurate. So I put this together and uploaded it, and almost immediately YouTube started recommending this video in their suggested videos. Clearly YouTube thought it was interesting to its viewers and wanted to get it out there. But almost immediately there was a copyright claim against the video and the video was blocked. It's important to mention that on the same day that I released this video on YouTube, I reached out to the BBC to seek their permission. Essentially, I told them that I was producing these videos as an educational resource and I thought people would be interested in it. I specifically sought permission on a limited license basis to use the video as an educational resource, breaking it down into individual educational points of interest, and then waited for a response. The BBC responded the very next day, quite rightly, to say that they did not object to my using the material if it was an exception allowable under UK copyright law. But they went on to say that I might have difficulties with YouTube online trackers if I didn't license the clips. The combination of those 2 points made me a little uncertain as to whether the BBC was actually objecting to my use of the video, even though I'd made clear that it was educational, it was fair use, and I understand fair use being an intellectual property barrister, and I provided a link to the video so they could review it to make sure they were happy with my use. Now, whilst fair use is decided on a case-by-case basis, generally the copyright holder would be expected to consider whether the use of the material comes under one of these exceptions. Because under Section 30, subsection 1 of the Copyright Designs and Patent Act 1988, it is a specific defence if the use is for the purposes of criticism and review. I feel that if the BBC had considered this properly, they will see that my video is completely different from the original, in that it is an educational resource, commenting on various elements of the script, educational points, and whether any points are inaccurate. So I submitted a challenge to the copyright claim and contacted the BBC once more, saying perhaps I'd misunderstood in that I thought they were allowing my use of it because the video comes under fair dealing, as it is a criticism video of the original episode. The BBC rejected my challenge and the copyright claim stands. They told me that they apply this policy to all YouTube users that use a high percentage of footage in their videos. But in my view, this position is wrong. There's a number of high-profile cases in the UK, such as Fraser Woodward Limited against the BBC and Brighter Pictures Limited. The important issues decided in this case that relate to me and my video were whether the use was for the purposes of criticism and review and whether the use was fair dealing. So I wrote a fairly lengthy explanation as to why I believe my video comes under the defence of fair dealing. I sent this off to the BBC, but I didn't get a reply. So I've now filed this as an appeal through YouTube, and they have a choice as to how to respond. They can just let it expire and the copyright claim will disappear. But what I feel is more likely to happen is they will request YouTube to take down the video and issue a copyright strike against my channel. even though my use of the material is firmly within UK copyright laws. If the BBC does request the removal of my video, whether immediately or a delayed takedown, I will have no alternative but to submit a counter notification, after which they must prove to YouTube that they've initiated court proceedings to keep my video down. I feel that this would be an unfortunate and unnecessary waste of time, and such a challenge should not succeed. So I hope this video was useful in helping you to understand copyright laws and YouTube copyright claims by telling you my BBC copyright dispute story. Please feel free to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you receive new videos, and thanks for watching.